Hello. If you happen to be joining me, I forgot until this morning that I had rescheduled this for today. And so I haven't actually heard from Michelle because I forgot to double check on everything. But so it might be a little bit chaotic, but I'm going to try and just go ahead with the live stream since I've rescheduled it already. Hopefully Michelle will join, but if not, I know she has a lot going on. School has started up again, and she also just recently got nominated for a pretty big award. So, uh, oh, I just got a text from her. I know we're live, but I'm just going to reply really quick and then I can just go into this. We'll see. If she's able to come, that's fine. Otherwise, I'll just go ahead and do the live. So the book that we were talking about was The Anatomy of Story by John Truby, which I want to apologize in advance for having assigned summer reading like I'm a high school teacher. Like, this was not a fun summer read book at all. It was kind of a slog to get through, if I'm honest. Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't think anyone's watching right now, but yep, I'm probably going to be doing this by myself. But so, Anatomy of Story by John Truby, it was actually really good. Like, it was really interesting. I feel like I learned a lot from it. I feel like his processes were a lot more accessible and interesting to me than I think Save the Cat is. Save the Cat was so formulaic, and this one is so focused on diving into the plot aspects. So it was a lot more helpful. It was a lot easier to wrap my head around some things. However, reading the book, it was a lot. He likes to use a lot of examples that, let's just say, he's a big deal in Hollywood. Like, he's a big Hollywood guy. He has worked on a lot of really interesting stories. Like, the guy knows what he's talking about, but he likes to use a lot of examples of things that, like, if you don't know them, it's not helpful. And it's a lot of, like, if you haven't watched The Godfather or Tootsie or Casablanca, like, you're probably not going to know what he's talking about. I was really, like, going through, like, with a pencil and really taking a lot of notes. And I think after the first chapter, I realized, like, I just have to skip all of the examples that I'm not actually, like, familiar with. It's just not helpful. So it was kind of that kind of reading experience where you really have to, like, pick and choose the parts that you need. And I think going back to it in the future, it's really going to be helpful, especially with, like, mapping your story that way. I really enjoyed it, but it was a lot to read through. I'd love to know if anyone else has read it. It's not something you should assign for summer reading. It's it's almost too in depth. It's kind of like a, you've been writing for a while and now you need to really, like, hone in on what makes a story good. That's what he's really writing for. So let me just go a little bit more in depth into this. He works through a couple of different structures, and so a lot of it is really coming to, like, what the story is actually about. It's not really like a beginning, middle, end kind of book. It's a, what is your character doing in this book? Like, why did you choose this character? Why did you choose this story? What is the meat of the story going to be, and why is this going to stick with the reader? Which is really helpful. Like, honestly, in terms of, like, learning about storytelling, this book was phenomenal. He talks about, like, the story. Let's see, it's broken into sections, so let me just go over what it is. So he's got the 7 key steps to story structure. Let me start there and kind of go over what he says. So it's like he has the minimum steps, and then he has like a longer list, which I think is 22 steps. But the minimum list is you have to first have come up with like your character and what does he call it? He calls it something. It's like the premise, but he calls it something else, doesn't he? No, he does call it the premise. Okay, so it's defining your premise. So you already have to kind of know like the about of the story, and then you need to go in depth into weakness and need, desire, the opponent, the plan, the battle, self-equilibrium, and new equilibrium. Oh, self-revelation and new equilibrium. Which he then goes into like a lot of depth, and I feel like that chapter was maybe the most helpful in just story planning for me. That was really interesting, and he talks about like why these things are important. Then he'll give examples, and he'll use examples too, like Star Wars, or at one point he used Wuthering Heights, but then he lost me on that one because he was like, oh, this one movie version was better because it like ends after Kathy dies, and I was like, so you like it because it takes out all of like the hauntings and the moral aspects, and like I don't know. That one I was like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And like occasionally he'll use Jane Eyre. But for honestly, like most of his examples are like old style Hollywood movies, things that definitely made before the 90s, you know. There's not a lot of examples of, let's even just say like there's not Pixar. He's more into very like white man elitist type of movies. And they're good movies. Like he's not using them because they're not good movies. It just is a little limited in like the spectrum of movie that he talks about, and it is mostly movies that he's using as examples, and I don't think it's poorly done. I just think it is limited. And again, not helpful if you don't have a background in those stories. Like there's just no point in reading the examples that, for me at least, there's no point in reading the examples that I didn't have a background in. It just wasn't helpful at all. But the rest of his book, it would be like a quarter of this size if it didn't have all those examples. They are lengthy and numerous, but all of the meat in between them is super helpful. So he'll go in depth into what all of the aspects are, and then examples of how to use them, why they're important. And so it's not really like, he talks about anatomy of the story is not a formula, and he talks about how like using it as a formula can be really detrimental to writers, and I thought a lot of the things that he said were really, really helpful in that regard. And also kind of defining, like, people talk about like what your character needs versus what they want, and he talked about it in a different way, and it's been a little while since I've read this at this point. Let me try and go back to it. It's hard to talk about this by myself. Let me just go into it from this point. Okay, so he talks about like the weakness and the need being like the same thing, that they're missing something that is so profound it's ruining their life, and the need is what the hero must fulfill within himself in order to have a better life, and it usually involves overcoming a weakness and changing or growing in some way. That the need isn't like he needs a glass of water, that's not actually what a need is in a character sense. And I thought that was really like helpful to revisualize it that way, that like a need for a character needs to be something bigger than that, but it also can be something that isn't so tangible. Like they don't need to get a thing or to have a thing or to have some kind of change. Like it could be something even like more broad than that. What does he use? He uses an example. I mean, he uses Tootsie for everything. You almost have to watch Tootsie before you read this. Tootsie and The Godfather, like in every example. But Silence of the Lambs, which is one that I know, so I'm going to say it. But if you don't know Silence of the Lambs, again, it's not too helpful. But they're all very well-known things. But so he uses weakness is that Clarice is an inexperienced Clarice is inexperienced, suffering from haunting childhood memories and a woman in a man's world, and she needs to overcome her ghosts of her past and gain respect as a professional in a man's world. So the weakness and the need are tied in together, that kind of example. I think he also says, though, that the need is not necessarily the same as the desire. So once the weakness and the need have been decided, you must give your hero a desire, and the desire is what the character wants, his particular goal. And the story doesn't become interesting to the audience until the desire comes into play. But the desire doesn't have to come into play at the beginning, which is also super interesting. Like, I liked the way he discussed how you jump into storytelling in like a different way, in like a creative way, but then why it's important, not because that's how storytelling is, but because this is what is interesting from a reader perspective. Like, he does a lot of that, and I think that's a lot more helpful to the way my brain works than the sort of plugging in story structure. Again, the tone of the book may be a little elitist, but it is useful. I'd almost like to hear someone else comb through this text and, like, I don't know, give a different spectrum of examples. Or I'd like to read an updated version, maybe, where he talks about more modern storytelling. Maybe he talks about storytelling with more different cultural aspects, because this is so Hollywood based, and it's so like pre-90s Hollywood based, that I don't think it's as relatable now as it has been. And he's talking about like these great, amazing movies and why they've withstood the test of time, the storytelling structure that they use. And he also does talk about how it's different between a written story and a movie. He touches on that in several places, like why it works in one and not in another, which again, very helpful. But I think an updated version would be more useful to people, especially if you're not the type to watch old Hollywood movies. If you're like the kind of person who's like, no, it's in black and white, we're living in the color age now, I don't want to watch those movies. Like, that's not a reflection on you exactly. That's more of a reflection on just that, like, you're not as interested in the things of the past. Like, that's okay. You can like things that are modern and new and have new technology. Like, that's not a detriment to you. So I think him focusing so much on older movies and kind of showing them as like these greats isn't as useful as it could be. I think more modern examples would really help this book, and it would help to make it more interesting, because it was a little like pulling teeth to read it. And I know it is kind of a textbook. He's a teacher, he is trying to teach it like a class, and there's a lot of like examples that you can then use. And I did map out one of my stories using his story structure, and it really did open my eyes to especially like the characters' needs and wants, and like what the driving force of the story is. Completely opened my eyes to it. It was really, really fascinating. At the same time, like, there's just so much. I think also he talks about like the conflict between characters, and like that this character's conflict is affecting this character's conflict, and like the conflict webs. Those were fascinating. I really liked that. Where is that? I think that's in story web, isn't it? Or is this in character web? Oh man, there's so many sections and they're all so kind of intertwined. Let me try and flip through. There really is. There's a lot of really good stuff in this. Oh, Harry Potter is probably the most recent example in this. I just saw it. Harry Potter is used several times. It is probably the most recent example. So if you're looking for something that's more modern than that, this is not the book that's going to give it to you. Where are... Maybe they're earlier than I thought. Okay. I should have probably marked this, but I'm not sure where those are. But this maybe will give you a behind the scenes of how I film my videos. I have to cut out these long sections where I'm just like fascinatedly looking through something. This is why I'm not so good at doing the live shows. But yeah, I would recommend this as like a intermediate to advanced level storytelling book. This is definitely not the kind of book that you would just jump into as a new writer at all, and it's not for that. It's definitely you've tried your craft and something's not working, and this is why it's not working, and this is the specific ways of how to fix it and where to fix it, which it honestly, like, it changed the way I was thinking about the story that I was really struggling with, and it changes the way I'm thinking about future stories and like what's important in them. So I think this is an invaluable text. I think that writers should read this text. I think it's very, very helpful. On the other hand, again, it's so outdated that there's a lot in it that isn't going to be useful to you. You will have to kind of pick and choose your chapters, and it's not going to write the story for you, like story structure as in like plot arcs and the 3 acts and all of that. And he talks about how like that's not necessary. You don't need to like set yourself into that box. Like that's not really helpful. It's more of like guidelines, and if you're using it as a formula, you're going to fall flat, which I've talked about. I feel like the AuthorTube talks about Save the Cat so much. Like that was such a thing, especially in like the last, I think this was like a year ago, everyone was into Save the Cat. And it's so formulaic that you do end up with a lot of formulas, and you end up with people boxing things into places, and it's not always that useful. But he talks about this more in a fluid, creative sense that I think is useful, and that if you kind of have the knowledge of story structure to begin with, you understand why the layers that he's talking about and the pieces and the building blocks are so important to create that structure and to make it interesting and useful to you. Yeah. Okay, so Michelle's definitely not going to be here, so I will just kind of wrap up my thoughts on this. Let me reply to her. Okay. Yes. I would love to hear any questions. I know I didn't even advertise this. I totally forgot that we had moved this to today. I've not been keeping track of time too well lately. So it's my fault. I didn't really check in with anybody, and I didn't advertise this. But if you have any questions, or if you have read this, please let me know in the comment section down below. I would love to hear what people thought of Anatomy of Story, because I thought it was so interesting and helpful, and at the same time, like, oh, it was such a pain to read through, and it was so elitist in so many ways. So I'm back and forth on it, and I'd love to know if there are any writing books that are similar to this one in like their approach, but maybe have a different perspective and a different twist that isn't so Hollywood focused. I would definitely like to hear about those. And I think this is going to be my shortest live yet, but just me talking by myself about it, there's not as much to say. So yes, let me know your thoughts, and I would love to engage with people down in the comments and see what other people thought about John Truby's The Anatomy of Story. So let me know, and I will talk to you again soon, and we will have a more cohesive live for you sometime in the future. But thank you so much, and bye.